The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning when the drought had already claimed half of Samuel Pierce's cattle and turned his once green pastures into a wasteland of cracked earth and dying grass. His weathered hands shook as he read the banker's neat handwriting, each word falling like stones into the silence of his kitchen. 60 days. That was all the time he had left before the bank would foreclose on the ranch that had been in his family for 3 generations. Samuel crumpled the letter and threw it into the cold fireplace, watching it land among the ashes of last winter's fires. Outside, the merciless Colorado sun beat down on land that hadn't seen rain in 4 months, and the few remaining cattle stood listless in whatever shade they could find. His water wells had run dry 2 weeks ago, and the creek that had once run clear and cold through his property was now nothing but a ribbon of dust, marked by the bleached bones of fish. At 52, Samuel had weathered droughts before, had seen lean years and fat ones, but nothing like this. The land itself seemed to be dying, and with it, everything he had ever worked for. His wife Elena had died 3 years ago, leaving him alone with their memories and a ranch that felt too big for one man to manage. His son had gone east to college and never returned, choosing the certainty of city life over the gamble of ranching. Now, sitting in the kitchen where Eleanor had once filled the air with the scent of fresh bread and laughter, Samuel felt the weight of his failures pressing down like the relentless heat. He had tried everything he knew, every technique his father had taught him, every modern method he had read about in the agricultural journals. Nothing had worked. The land was broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. It was then that he heard the horses. Samuel stepped onto his porch, squinting against the glare, and saw them approaching through the heat shimmer. 3 riders, moving with the easy grace of people who had grown up in the saddle. As they drew closer, he could see they were Ute, probably from the reservation about 50 miles south. The leader was an older man with silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to hold the wisdom of centuries. Beside him rode a younger man, perhaps 30, with the bearing of a warrior. The third was a woman, her long black hair braided with beads that caught the sunlight like captured stars. They stopped at the edge of his property, respecting the invisible boundary that separated his world from theirs. The older man raised his hand in greeting, and Samuel found himself walking toward them, drawn by something he couldn't name. "You are Samuel Pierce," the man said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, and you are?" "I am Joseph Walking Bear. This is my son Thomas and my daughter Ayana." He gestured to his companions, who nodded gravely. "We have been watching your land die." Samuel felt heat rise in his face, the defensive anger of a man who had been judged and found wanting. "If you're here to tell me I'm a poor rancher, you're wasting your time. I know my land is failing." Walking Bear's expression didn't change. "We are not here to judge. We are here because the land is calling for help, and you are the only one who can hear it." "I don't understand." "You will." Walking Bear dismounted with fluid grace despite his age. "Your grandfather, William Pierce, was a friend to our people. When the army came to move us to the reservation, he testified on our behalf. He said that we belonged to this land as much as the buffalo or the eagles." Samuel remembered the stories, half-forgotten tales his grandfather had told him as a child. Stories of trading with the Ute, of learning from them, of a time when the boundaries between peoples were more fluid than the rigid lines that now separated ranch from reservation. "That was a long time ago," Samuel said. "Time is a circle, not a line." Ayana spoke for the first time, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who thought in one language but spoke in another. "What was before can be again, if we have the courage to remember." Walking Bear nodded approvingly at his daughter's words. "Your land is dying because you have forgotten how to listen to it. Your cattle are dying because you have forgotten how they should live. The grass is dying because you have forgotten how it should grow." Samuel felt a flicker of hope mixed with desperate skepticism. "And you know how to fix it." "We know how to live with it," Thomas said, "as our people have done for 1,000 years. Why would you help me?" Walking Bear looked out over the failing ranch, his eyes seeing something Samuel couldn't. Because the land doesn't recognize the boundaries white men draw on paper. Because when this land dies, it takes part of us with it. And because, he paused, choosing his words carefully, because your grandfather once helped us when we had nowhere else to turn. That evening, Samuel found himself sitting around a small fire with the 3 Ute visitors, sharing beans and coffee while they talked about the land in ways he had never heard before. They spoke of grass as if it were a living community, of cattle as if they were part of a larger family, of water as if it were the blood of the earth itself. "You graze your cattle in the same places all year," Walking Bear observed. "You never let the grass rest, never let it recover." "I move them sometimes," Samuel protested. "Moving them from one dying pasture to another is not the same as understanding the rhythm of growth and rest," Ayana said gently. "The grass needs time to sink deep roots, to store energy for the hard times. When you keep cutting it down, it becomes weak, unable to survive the drought." Thomas leaned forward, his face serious in the firelight. "Our people followed the buffalo for generations. We learned that the herds must move constantly, never staying in one place long enough to damage the grass. The buffalo would graze an area and move on, and the grass would grow back stronger than before. But I don't have thousands of acres to move them across," Samuel said. "You don't need thousands of acres," Walking Bear replied. "You need to understand the pattern. Even on your land, there are places where the grass is stronger, places where it is weaker, places where the soil holds moisture longer, places where it dries out fast. You must learn to read these signs." As the night wore on, Samuel found himself listening to concepts that seemed to turn everything he thought he knew about ranching upside down. They spoke of working with the land's natural rhythms rather than against them, of seeing his ranch as part of a larger ecosystem rather than a factory for producing beef. "Stay with us," Walking Bear said as the fire burned low. "Come to our reservation. Learn what we can teach you, but understand this is not something you can learn in a few days. It will take months, maybe longer." Samuel thought of the bank letter, of the 60 days he had left. "I don't have months." "You don't have a choice," Ayana said quietly. "Either you learn a new way, or you lose everything anyway." The next morning, Samuel loaded his few remaining cattle into a neighbor's truck and drove them to the livestock auction. He sold them for less than they were worth, but the money would buy him a few months of time. Then he locked up his house, left a note for the mailman, and drove south toward the reservation. The Ute reservation was a world apart from anything Samuel had ever experienced. The houses were simple, many of them trailers or small government-built structures, but they were surrounded by gardens that seemed to thrive despite the drought. Children played in the dust, their laughter carrying on the wind, while elders sat in the shade and worked on crafts that told stories Samuel was only beginning to understand. Walking Bear housed him in a small cabin that had once belonged to a tribal member who had passed away the previous winter. It was sparse but clean, with a bed, a table, and a small wood stove. More importantly, it had a window that looked out over the valley, where the tribe grazed their own cattle, and Samuel could see immediately that their animals looked healthier than his had. "The first lesson," Walking Bear said on Samuel's first morning, "is to learn to see." They walked out into the pasture where the tribal cattle grazed, and Samuel was amazed at what he observed. The animals were constantly moving, never staying in one spot for more than a few hours. They grazed in tight groups, protected by riders who moved them like a dance choreographed by generations of experience. "See how they eat?" Thomas pointed to a group of cows. "They take a bite, then move on. They don't stand in one place and eat everything down to the roots." Samuel watched, and gradually he began to understand. The cattle were mimicking the behavior of buffalo, the natural grazers that had shaped this landscape for thousands of years. They moved in patterns that allowed the grass to recover, that spread their manure naturally, that created the conditions for healthy growth. "But how do you know where to move them?" Samuel asked. Ayana knelt and picked up a handful of soil, letting it run through her fingers. "The land tells you. You just have to learn its language." The weeks that followed were like going back to school, but in a classroom without walls, where the lessons were written in the language of wind and rain, soil and grass, sun and shadow. Samuel learned to read the subtle signs that indicated when grass was ready to be grazed and when it needed to rest. He learned to identify the plants that indicated healthy soil and those that warned of problems. Most importantly, he learned to think in terms of relationships rather than resources. The grass wasn't just something to be consumed by cattle. It was part of a complex web of interactions that included soil, microorganisms, insects, birds, and countless other creatures he had never noticed before. "White men see the land as something to be conquered," Walking Bear explained one evening, as they sat watching the sunset paint the mountains purple and gold. "They think they can force it to produce what they want. But the land has its own wisdom, its own ways of healing and growing. When you work with that wisdom instead of against it, miracles happen." Samuel was beginning to understand what he meant. He had seen patches of overgrazed land recover in just a few weeks when managed properly. He had watched sick cattle regain their health when allowed to graze diverse plants, instead of being confined to single-species pastures. He had witnessed the return of birds and small animals to areas that had seemed lifeless just months before. But the most important lesson came from Ayana, who had become his most patient teacher. She taught him about the medicine plants that grew wild on the range, plants that could heal both cattle and the land itself. She showed him how to read the behavior of animals, how to understand what they were telling him about the condition of the grass, the presence of predators, the approach of weather. "My grandmother used to say that the land and the people are one body," she told him one afternoon, as they rode through a valley where the grass was beginning to show the first hints of recovery. "When the land is sick, the people are sick. When the people are sick, the land is sick. Healing comes only when both are healed together." Samuel found himself thinking about those words as he lay in his narrow bed at night, listening to the sounds of the reservation settling into sleep. He had come here to learn techniques that might save his ranch, but he was discovering something much deeper. He was learning to see himself as part of the land rather than separate from it, to understand that his success was inseparable from the health of the ecosystem he lived within. The months passed like seasons, each one bringing new understanding. Samuel learned to make his own medicines from plants he had previously considered weeds. He learned to predict weather patterns by watching the behavior of animals and the subtle changes in plant growth. He learned to manage cattle using techniques that had been perfected over centuries of observation and adaptation. But perhaps most importantly, he learned to be patient. The white man's way was to force quick results, to push the land and the animals to produce immediately. The Ute way was to understand that real healing took time, that sustainable abundance could only come from working with natural rhythms rather than against them. As winter approached, Samuel knew his time at the reservation was coming to an end. The bank would be expecting payment soon, and he needed to return to his ranch to implement what he had learned. The thought terrified him. It was one thing to understand these concepts in theory, another to apply them to land that had been degraded by decades of mismanagement. On his last night at the reservation, the tribe held a ceremony in his honor. They sat around a fire built in the traditional way, and Walking Bear spoke words that seemed to come from the depths of time itself. "You came to us as a stranger," he said, "but you are leaving as family. You carry with you not just knowledge, but responsibility. The land will test you, as it tests all of us. But remember that you are not alone. The wisdom of our ancestors goes with you, and the land itself will guide you if you remember how to listen." Ayana stepped forward and placed a leather pouch in Samuel's hands. "Seeds," she said simply, "from the grasses that grew here before the white man came. Plant them when the time is right, and they will help heal your land." Samuel felt tears in his eyes, emotions he had kept buried since Elena's death finally rising to the surface. "Why have you done this for me?" "Because healing the land heals all of us," Walking Bear replied. "Because the boundaries between peoples are illusions, but the connection between all living things is real. Because your grandfather understood this truth, and now you understand it too." Samuel returned to his ranch in early spring, when the first green shoots were beginning to push through the soil. The place looked even more desolate than he remembered, but now he saw it with different eyes. Where once he had seen only failure, he now saw potential. Where once he had seen problems, he now saw opportunities. The first thing he did was divide his property into smaller sections using temporary fencing. It seemed counterintuitive, making his grazing area smaller, but he had learned that intensive grazing for short periods, followed by long rest periods, was the key to healing the land. Next, he used the last of his money to buy a small herd of cattle, but these were different from the ones he had sold. These were hardier breeds, animals that could thrive on diverse forage rather than requiring expensive grain supplements. He managed them the way Thomas had taught him, moving them frequently, never allowing them to overgraze any area. The work was exhausting. Without the money to hire help, Samuel had to move cattle every few days, repair fencing, and monitor the health of both animals and grass. But gradually, he began to see results. Areas that had been bare dirt began to show signs of life. The creek, dry for months, began to flow again as the improved soil held more water. Most remarkably, the native grasses that Ayana had given him began to establish themselves. They grew slowly at first, but their deep roots were perfectly adapted to the local climate. As they spread, they created habitat for insects, birds, and small mammals that had been absent from the ranch for years. The bank inspector came in early summer, expecting to find a property ready for foreclosure. Instead, he found something he had never seen before. A ranch that was actually improving during one of the worst droughts in recent memory. The grass was green, the cattle were healthy, and the water sources were flowing. "I don't understand," the inspector said as he walked through pastures that should have been dust. "How is this possible?" Samuel smiled, thinking of the lessons he had learned and the people who had taught them. "I finally learned how to listen." The inspector extended Samuel's loan, amazed by the transformation he had witnessed. Word spread quickly through the ranching community about the miracle that had occurred on the Pierce ranch. Neighbors came to see for themselves, and many left convinced that Samuel had discovered something extraordinary. But Samuel knew better. He hadn't discovered anything new. He had simply remembered something very old, something that had been proven over thousands of years of careful observation and adaptation. He had learned to work with the land rather than against it, to see himself as part of the ecosystem rather than separate from it. As the summer progressed, Samuel found himself becoming an informal teacher, sharing what he had learned with other ranchers who were struggling with similar problems. Some were skeptical, unable to believe that Indian methods could succeed where modern techniques had failed. But others were desperate enough to try anything, and many of them began to see results. The ranch that had once been dying became a model of sustainable agriculture. Visitors came from across the state to see the innovative grazing techniques, the restored grasslands, the healthy cattle thriving on native plants. Agricultural universities sent students to study the methods Samuel had implemented. But the most meaningful visitor came in late autumn, when the first snow was beginning to dust the mountains. Samuel was working in the barn when he heard the sound of horses approaching. He looked up to see Walking Bear, Thomas, and Ayana riding toward him, their faces bright with smiles. "We came to see how our student is doing," Walking Bear said as he dismounted. Samuel gestured toward the thriving pastures, the healthy cattle, the clear water flowing in the creek. "See for yourself." They walked through the ranch together, and Samuel could see the approval in their eyes. The land was healing, not just surviving, but thriving. The grass was thick and diverse, the soil was dark and rich, and the whole ecosystem was coming back to life. "You have done well," Ayana said, as they stood beside the creek where native plants were beginning to reclaim the banks. "But more importantly, you have remembered who you are." "Who am I?" Samuel asked. "You are a healer," Walking Bear replied, "a bridge between the old ways and the new, a keeper of wisdom that the world desperately needs." Indeed, that evening, they sat around a fire in Samuel's yard, sharing stories and laughter under a sky brilliant with stars. Samuel felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since Elena's death, a sense of belonging that went deeper than ownership of land. "I have something for you," he said, disappearing into the house. When he returned, he carried a leather folder containing legal documents. "I've been thinking about this for months, and I've made a decision." He handed the folder to Walking Bear, who opened it with curious eyes. Inside were papers that would deed a portion of Samuel's ranch to the Ute tribe, creating a permanent partnership between the reservation and the restored land. "This is your home too," Samuel said. "Your wisdom saved this place. It's only right that you should have a legal claim to it." Walking Bear looked at the papers for a long moment, then passed them to his children. Thomas and Ayana read them with growing amazement. "This is not necessary," Walking Bear said finally. "You owe us nothing." "I'm not doing this because I owe you," Samuel replied. "I'm doing it because it's right. Because the land doesn't recognize the boundaries we draw on paper. Because what we've created here is bigger than any one person or any one people." The ceremony that followed was simple but profound. Under the light of the full moon, Samuel and Walking Bear signed the papers that would forever link their peoples and their lands. It was a healing that went beyond the restoration of grass and soil, a healing of the wounds that had divided communities for generations. Years later, when agricultural experts came to study the Pierce Ute Ranch, they found something unprecedented. A partnership that had transformed degraded land into a thriving ecosystem while providing economic benefits to both native and non-native communities. The ranch became a model for sustainable agriculture, proof that ancient wisdom and modern needs could work together to create solutions that benefited everyone. Samuel, now in his 60s, continued to manage the ranch with the help of young tribal members who were learning to combine traditional knowledge with contemporary ranching techniques. He had never remarried, but he was not alone. The community that had grown around the ranch had become his family, and the land that had once been dying had become his life's work. On quiet evenings, when the cattle were settled and the day's work was done, Samuel would sometimes walk out into the pastures and simply listen. The land spoke to him now, in ways it never had before, telling him stories of growth and healing, of resilience and renewal. He had learned to hear its voice, and in return it had taught him who he was meant to be. The drought that had nearly destroyed his ranch was now just a memory, but the lessons it had taught him would last forever. He had learned that true wealth came not from forcing the land to produce, but from understanding how to help it flourish. He had learned that the deepest wisdom often came from the most unexpected sources, and that healing required not just techniques, but a fundamental change in the way he saw himself and his place in the world. Most importantly, he had learned that the boundaries between peoples were artificial constructs, but the connections between all living things were real and eternal. He had studied with the tribe for months, and in return they had given him the wisdom to save not just his ranch but his soul. The story of Samuel Pierce and the Ute tribe became legend in the valley, passed down through generations as proof that understanding could triumph over prejudice, that cooperation could overcome conflict, and that the ancient wisdom of the land could provide solutions to even the most modern problems. And on the ranch that had once been dying, the grass grew thick and green, the cattle grazed in harmony with the land, and the water flowed clear and cold, carrying with it the promise that when people learn to listen, the earth itself will teach them how to heal.